Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guests today are,
Faye Ginsburg.
And Rayna Rapp.
and it's a very great privilege to be here with both of you. Here, of course, being in fact at distance over Zoom, sad to say, but you are actually physically together in a room, which is lovely. It, as I said, is a great privilege to be chatting with you today. And I wanted to begin with my banal, stereotypical, but I think important in some ways inquiry, which is to ask what's currently animating, dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying you? What's currently going on?
Great. So we'll continue in our alphabetical order, but we are tied at the hip and our work is constantly evolving
And we like to finish each other's sentences. So
jointly. So our book came out in 2024 and it's threaded through with both the sad and difficult stories around disability, but with a thread of optimism throughout of things getting better over time for people with disabilities. Sadly, after our book came out in March 2024, as we know, Trump was elected. Actually, the evening we were giving a talk at the Humanities Center. And the dismantling of so much of what we describe in the book, including like very long-standing legislation that mandates education for people with disabilities alongside their typical peers, destigmatizing projects of all sorts, which are rapidly being dismantled, the erasure of data about folks with disabilities that have just like mushroomed into a really terrifying zeitgeist that is really dismantling much of what we found to be so positive. So we're working on that, and Rayna's going to describe a bit more of that.
I would only say that activism among people with disabilities and their allies continues apace, and that's the good news, but it's hard sometimes to see its effect. They have been enormously present at every one of the national marches and at the protests, especially in front of the education department and in anything having to do with the dismantling of healthcare and Social Security, because those resources, modest as they are the ones on which disabled people have to make provision for their own lives. So that's been a big part of what we've been tracking. And as Faye said, the disappearance of disability data, which is a convenient way of making sure you don't know how lethal the policies of the present administration are, whether they're in denying children services in the school. 15% of American kids roughly get special ed services in the school, or they're making sure that you have no support and institutionalization, the threats of reinstitutionalization. It's just legion and it's ongoing. But the only good news there is, and I wish we would get up our own slide to look at it, there is a litany of projects which immediately responded by trying to rescue that same disability. We have the Data Rescue Project, the Free Government Information Group, the STAT group, the data.cdc.gov group, and reports on public access for data all over the place, including even last late winter, CNN put on national television a lesson on how to use the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. And there is a new site as well called Disability Statistics, founded by about and for people with disabilities, all of whom are trying to preserve that data so that essentially there should be a baseline. Wonky as that may sound, it's an absolutely essential service on which to found any other critique and lawsuit, because the lawsuits are ongoing like crazy about the Department of Ed, the defunding of the workforce, but also whether or not you can actually get kind of bipartisan subcommittees in Senate or in the House to actually support specific services. So, I mean, those struggles are just very fluid.
Yeah, so we do, you may notice that our approach is to point out the dark side of what's going on, but to sustain our Pollyanna in hell approach to life and to say, well, there are the data rescuers out there. There are the protesters. Disability arts, which is one of our major chapters, and which interestingly thrived during COVID. The book actually we were finishing writing the book when COVID hit. So there are moments of light, and the arts community continues apace, but funding is being eliminated right and left. So yeah, so on the other hand, as we've learned from many, we are allies, or as some call us, accomplices to more activist folks who come from the disability community, which we are part of as well as parents and advocates and writers and all those things. Disabled folks are very used to working with limited resources and a lot of stigma being brought against them. So weirdly, if you talk to disabled artists now, like they'll say, well, it's not like we weren't in training for this for a long time.
We've known this was going to happen on some level. We couldn't have predicted exactly the Trumpian level of cruelty, but the idea of exclusion and marginality, that's just a part of the life of living with disability. So there is a kind of advocacy and self-advocacy that's kind of built into anybody who survives.
And so in the last couple of years, you guys have co-authored the book Disability Worlds and co-edited along with others How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic. And it seems to me one of the important features in this is what some people call artivism. You cite extensively in the co-authored volume Douglas Crimp's famous essay from 1987 about the necessity in terms of AIDS activism to insist on various norms, but also the centrality of art to that. So I wondered if you might just talk a little bit about connections between AIDS and disability in terms of activism, art, and so on. Is there any kind of genealogy there that you draw?
That's a really interesting question. In the How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic book, there is one chapter that is historical about the AIDS activists as kind of prefiguring an understanding of what disability is. It doesn't focus directly on the arts, but it does focus on the way in which there is a prehistory here, which in some ways has influenced a sense of what public resources and public kind of discourse might be about. The disability arts movement is been ongoing, as Faye said.
Preceded the AIDS activist movement. So it's a very interesting point at which, they share discursive strategies, even if they hadn't been immediately recognized at the time, although I think they increasingly are recognizing the kind of shared discursive strategies of really demonstrating, the impossible, demonstrating their existence, and that being atypical, being chronically ill, having all these other things are features of humanity that need to be recognized and addressed, and they eventually are part of everyone's lives. So I don't know if you want to.
Just to say that there has been a kind of archaeology museums looking at this stuff.
In terms of the present conjuncture, how do you account for the particular assault on disabled people on the part of the current administration? Can we explain that? Is there a way to comprehend why they're doing this?
We know that Trump despises disabled people. He famously has a nephew, anyway, who had a disabled, there was a disabled child in the family, and he was just like, basically saying, let that child die. He's really is offended by the presence of disabled people, as he is by homeless people, many of whom are disabled, and wants them. It's kind of like a reversion to what famously have been called the ugly laws in the United States, which was the criminalization of being visibly disabled in public, which were laws that actually endured in many cities into the 1970s. So we're kind of back to the idea of the ugly laws.
His idea that disability is not just a human difference but a weakness. He made fun famously of an important New York Times reporter as being disabled and seeing him as weak and making fun of him in his 2016 campaign
Yeah.
already. And so this whole idea that, somehow if you have a disability, you're weak, and he can't stand weak, and he is a bully against weak. So that distortion comes with the territory from way back.
Yeah, and also, his disdain for people who've served in the military and were injured, who
Right.
basically are
Right,
one of the largest portions of the demographic of disabled people. So he's very, and that's probably where he's most tripped up, like when he made fun of the Times reporter, the disabled who had arthrogryposis, it mimicked his hand movements and so forth. He really lost a lot of points on that, so it's not a widely accepted point of view. On the other hand, he's slashing and burning through any funding or
Well,
support.
and that's the other thing is
Yeah.
that special ed is expensive compared to the rest of the ed, budget. And so the idea that you could just get rid of it if you dismantled the workforce in the education department, that goes for the Medicaid as well. I mean, it's really every part of it that can be seen as, a Doge kind of, phony budgetary pullback, clawback is in fact hurting disabled people. So just seeing them as an expensive extravaganza that he and his minions do not want to see funded.
So, getting back to the co-authored book, could you perhaps take us through that? Give us a panoramic view of what it's about and how you go about it, because it's a wonderful scholarly work in that it provides a very powerful foundation to the state of knowledge about disability, but it's also a terrific activist book because it has all kinds of instances of stories of hope, resources of hope.
Let me start, but I know Faye will jump in and you should interrupt me as given. We start the book by talking about how we ourselves entered disability worlds, which is we each had a kid. Faye and Fred's daughter, Samantha, had a very rare and very importantly complex, medically as well as socially, genetically defined difference. My kid just had a garden variety ordinary dyslexia, but we found ourselves having kids in the same schools and asking a lot of questions about why was there so much discrimination against children with disabilities. And it was piece by piece that in a sense our children opened up that world to us.
And I'm going to do what Rayna said and just briefly interrupt, because we are, and then you will go back to the
Right, chapters.
the chapters to answer Toby's question. We're anthropologists by training, so we're always imagining what other worlds are surrounding us, whether it's at a great distance or literally in the next room in our apartment. So we began to understand this, which is how we came to this idea of disability worlds, which is there was this entirely other universe and shaping of the human experience that's right in front of us, which neither of us, because of our experiences in life, had really actually encountered and recognized. Like, there, wow, how is it that we were so oblivious?
So that's my cue to interrupt. We both started out by asking our parents, gee, we've got these kids with disability labels and services. Where were these kids when we were growing up? And the short answer was they were basically hidden. Both of our mothers, as it turned out, had been remedial reading teachers, right? And they were able to say, well, we knew which kids down the block, weren't kept out of school or put in institutions, but nobody much talked about it. Apart from kids who survived polio, and not all of them did, who were in the school with crutches and braces, mostly you didn't see them, certainly when we were growing up. It's really due to progressive legislation, slowly but surely, that the visibility of kids with disabilities in the schools and in the communities, in our religious institutions and our community centers, that all happened after our growing up. And that was part of what we were discovering, is that it's not only that there are disability worlds, but that they have histories. And until those children and those families become more publicly visible, there is no way to understand to what extent disability has been an aspect of the human experience forever. There's now archaeology, including a new book coming out on disabled archaeologists and their findings, which, was inconceivable literally at the time that we started this project. So
I mean, just as an example, I mean, in my block in South Chicago, my parents literally could walk us through different families, and if you had a child born with Down syndrome,
right,
the child would be whisked away. You would be, as famously happened to Eric Erikson, the famous,
and Arthur Miller,
the famous playwright and the psychologist. They told the mother that her child had died, and no one actually knew that the child had gone on to live a robust life with basically sort of foster families who supported these kids. I mean, so there's just quite an interest, and also as Rayna said, this the legislation didn't happen by magic. There's just an extraordinary history of activism, which we try and chronicle in a somewhat reduced form in the book, but certainly
but
led
families.
by parents, initiated a lot of the activism and got things moving. So, but anyway, to run through the book.
Right, so we begin there with our own kids, but then discovering that there is both a culture of disability and a history of disability, and move on to what we call highfalutinly the double telos of modernity, looking at the medical science of genetic testing and neuro imaging of brains, but then the kind of pushback on the part of disability activists to say, these are not medical tragedies that need to be eliminated. These are part of the human conditions that need to be accommodated and taken care of and valued.
Well, and embraced. So we're really putting, let's say, the neo-eugenic practice of genetic testing on fetuses next to disability activism that embraces the glory of human difference. So that's what we call the double telos, which surprisingly
nobody picks up on, because
some of our students have
two
repeated
graduate students have picked up on it. It's too complicated a concept. However, we also wrote in the next chapter about what we've called new kinship imaginaries, and that one's a lot easier for people to grasp, that every family who enters disability, unbeknownst to themselves most of the time, the vast majority of time, has to reimagine what family life is like, whether it means building a ramp to get up the front steps, or it means reimagining a life in which your kid might not go to college but still have a perfectly excellent and honorable life, or it means rethinking what it means to have a disabled adult in your family. I mean, all of those things are part of reimagining kinship. And again, as anthropologists, that question of paying attention to kinship was very, very central for us. We did a lot of interviewing with families. We did a lot of work with family activists.
And also we really profited from the incredibly robust literature coming out of disability studies and disability activism. So there's a whole language called crip kinship. So the embrace of the idea of crip, which is again similar to the embrace of the idea of queer. So taking a stigmatized term and turning it around. So crip kinship is very interesting because it's not just your biological families, of course, which we know historically is always true, but that people find kinship within the disability community in a very robust and creative way. So that idea of crypt kinship was really, an important intersection between our anthropological training and our embrace of all the really lively work coming out of disability studies.
Right. We also talk in chapters that follow that about the paradox of recognition and what we call the social production of moxie. That is, that you have to fight for a label for yourself or your kid, but that the label itself is disabling, and both things are true. You know, without the label, you can't get services, you can't get government aid, you can't get education. There's lots of stuff you can't get without a label, but the label itself stigmatizes, medicalizes, does all that stuff we know that makes you a second-class citizen. So that strategy goes on. We went from there to the transitioning, what we call the transitioning to nowhere, looking at what happens to young adults when they move out of their entitled services within the educational system, because bad and patchy as it may be, until you graduate high school or reach the age of 21 in this country, you're entitled to educational services. But after that, while services may be there, you and your family are really on your own, and you have to figure out how to take the lead and become the center of planning for the next stages of your adult life. So.
And especially when you see people, you know, kids can go to school and expect to be integrated into the social worlds around them. And then they hit what is called by many the disability cliff. They suddenly discover the world is not so hospitable. There aren't structures around them that are supportive. They can't go to, you have to actually at that point, it's not an entitlement. You have to bring a lawsuit. You have to, you know, go through often to considerable struggle and expense to get the supports you need as an adult. So the disability cliff is a very big, and the transitioning to nowhere was actually the name of a report, which
it's already an old report,
yeah.
But it's a really important report that says New York City, which is where we did our research, but much of the country at that point was not in compliance with the idea that kids with disability services getting out of high school were entitled to transition planning to figure out what came next. So that whole process, again, struggle, and increasingly by people with disability themselves. That is, by the time you're 16 or 18, you're part of the activism that keeps your life kind of on track.
Or you're supposed to be.
Yeah. So, but we also, again, to talk about what you asked first, to be about arts, we have a chapter after that that we call Living Otherwise, Worlding Disability Arts, because one of the enormous centers of visibility, a kind of prefigurative moment, is to see what's going on in the world of film, dance, museums, music. I mean, there's just so much. Television is full of this stuff, you know. Honorable people will disagree about Coda and the Oscar, but guess what? It's out there, you know. That was not even conceivable 10 years before it happened. So a lot of this stuff is very recent.
And also, so I've been involved in starting a disability film festival called Real Ability. So it's highly, you know, interwoven with our own activism and advocacy, which is now the festivals in like 37 cities, and we're in our 17th year now, and it's
in the US.
No, all over the place. Because we have anyway, so we're very, you know, engaged with that also because we started the Center for Disability Studies at NYU and have been programming disability arts location. New York City is an incredible center of very creative disability arts that we were able to, we've been inviting disability artists to be presenting here. We collaborate with museums. And there's also a really interesting dimension of this, which we call aesthetics of access, or many people call it that, which is how do you build in things like, so let's think about the ways in which you make film accessible to blind or deaf audiences. So you have closed captioning, you have audio description. So rather than seeing that as just something that gets slapped on at the end, it's built into the whole aesthetic of a film project, for example. So there's just a lot of really interesting ways of rethinking everything we imagine about what, like, for example, a film should be, what television should be. So, so we've got that all in there. The other thing that we probably contributed to more than, let's say, other people writing on disability arts is recognizing what we call third space arts, which are projects for people with, let's say, developmental disabilities. They're not art therapy, but they might not be in that kind of high art category that gets reviewed in the New York Times, but provide all kinds of really interesting projects around poetry,
Theater.
yeah, stuff. So there's
Yeah.
just an increasing range that you're seeing that isn't just saying we're going to extend what we recognize as, in quotes, high arts, but we're also incorporating very different kinds of practices with very different kinds of populations.
And I guess in the book, I also want to say we end with reconfiguring the idea of disability worlds and talking about the importance of political activism, the various efforts to get out the vote, the ways in which people with disability have been barred from voting because voting is often inaccessible, and all the legislation involved in making it increasingly possible. But despite its imperfections, there's still issues about how people exercise their rights with disability, and also thinking about how that kind of activism is part of a disability future. After all, if we live long enough, we'll all face disability. One of our beloved anthropologists who we lost this year, Deva Kasnitz, talked about the difference between aging with disability and aging into disability. It's something we all should think about, because if we live long enough, whether it's your hearing or your eyesight or your mobility or your cognition, something's going to give, right? Whereas people who've already experienced disability for a long or perhaps all stretches of their life are going to be in some ways more prepared to think about that future. So
Now,
that's
as
kind
part
we
of
end on
my
a more
new campaign that I'm starting to make the double telos of modernity become a hip expression. So in the 80s and early 90s, it was postmodernism. In the late 90s to 2000s, globalization. Now it's artificial intelligence, so on, right? That I think your little expression is the next one. But in all seriousness, one of the major topics that you address there in that chapter is eugenics. And I wanted to ask you about you. I think you used the expression neo-eugenics at one point. I wanted to ask you about so-called liberal eugenics. This is the argument that, in fact, things like prenatal testing are really forms of eugenics. And the reason why they're okay and cool is that they're not imposed by the state. But the only real problem with eugenics was its governmental imposition and control. And I wondered if you could comment a bit on that and where you would put conceptually and politically ideas like genetic testing in the context of the fact that for many of us, eugenics is just unmentionable other than in a condemnatory way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to turn this over to Rayna because
it's
so
complicated.
Yeah, we each have brought very different legacies of study to this. And Rayna's been working, wrote an important book on genetic testing.
A long time ago, in what now feels like the ice age of prenatal testing, I did a book on the social impact of amniocentesis when it was still a relatively new routinizing technology. And what I'd always say is that it's not a critique of the individual who chooses or refuses to use prenatal testing, but it is a recognition that while the social conditions of raising a child or dealing with a family member with how do you embrace somebody with a genetic difference? While those are so hard to still figure out in public, it's very hard to figure out what to do with the proliferation of genetic testing. We just had a friend in the office here an hour ago talking about what's called polygenic risk scores, which are these new extremely for-profit services that say, well, gee, if you give us money and if you do IVF, in vitro fertilization, that is, you don't just get pregnant the old-fashioned way, but rather you put an egg and a sperm together and pay a lot of money to have them done in a lab, you could then test for your risk of, I don't know, schizophrenia or, some possibilities of late in life cancers. Those tests themselves are just statistical uses of what's now out there. And you can test, I would say, with great deal of questionable accuracy, but you can test on everything from prenatal right through practically, every tumor that you could possibly have that has some life-threatening consequences right through the life cycle. So it's neo-eugenic in the sense of you choose it, you pay for it, or your health insurance does, although much of this stuff you have to be well heeled enough to put out the money for. But it's not as simple as, well, nobody should do this. It is really about a recognition of the larger social framework in which we have once again come back to genetic explanations for what are social inequalities. That is, what are we going to do about mental illness or challenges? I'm struggling for language here, beyond their medicalization. What are we going to do about the threats of reinstitutionalizing children or adults with cognitive or emotional impairments? What are we going to do about making sure there's a possible space for people to live out respected, dignified, pleasure-filled lives even after their family can no longer take care of them and they are aging? To the extent that those are social dilemmas, you can see the shortcut is to say, oh, well, they're all genetically caused, right? And let's test for them and we can eliminate those fetuses. Well, life is not that simple. Okay, I'm done. You add.
Well, I'll just speak from my own personal experience of this as a person who raised a child with a rare genetic condition that I am a carrier for, and my husband's a carrier for. And I'm the president of the foundation, the Familial Dysautonomia Foundation. And we were, raising money to find the gene. I had to scrub all of our publicity and websites when I became president of the word cure, because when this mutation occurs, because it occurs very extremely early, but certainly before birth, lots of damage, lots of things happen to the autonomic nervous system that will never be changed. But it was very important to find the gene. Some people will be using it for neo-eugenic purposes, and I would never judge them for making that choice. It's a very difficult disease to manage. But at the same time, it means that we are now able to make certain kinds of interventions that won't cure, but will make life more manageable. So it means like the teens who probably would have lost mobility by the age of 20, we're now doing our very, very first patient with these, particular interventions that genetic knowledge gave us, which seem to result in them not losing the capacity to walk later in life. So there's, it's complicated to have that kind of genetic knowledge and know what to do with it, obviously. So, but we are also trying to help people recognize that the embrace of disabled folks is a very important democratizing project, and it does have an intervention into that kind of discourse. We find when we teach undergrads who grew up post ADA, or some of them are
post IDEA.
They are themselves disabled. They have disabled folks in their families, across generations. They went to school with people. They have such different attitudes. It's very interesting. So it'll be interesting to see how those people are going to, how generations of that sort are starting to make use of these technologies or not, or refusing them.
We have always found that the younger students, our undergraduates and our graduate students, are actually much more accepting of disability for the reasons Faye just outlined. Whereas when you talk to the faculty, while some people have been fabulous and advocates and got it right away and have been helpful, other people will say things like, oh my God, I have to give them the test early. I have to give them extra time for the exam. I mean, this is really awful. I don't want to redo my lectures so that people with disabilities can have access to them in advance. So the idea that we're all going to have to change, even within an educational environment, it's still an ongoing process.
And just to help out some listeners with acronyms, the IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in the US, and the ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. These are the two bits of law that you've been partly referring to. And that is quite a disturbing story about faculty not becoming accustomed to new audiences, new needs. In fact, audiences and needs were always there, but they didn't bother to think about.
Or they weren't given the opportunity for education, or they were excluded from education, which would have, in a sense, gotten them off the on ramp, so to speak, to higher education. And now there's really, so many more people who've been able to go through that system successfully and to be part of higher education and have different kinds of opportunities and change the classrooms that we're in. Yeah, we have sometimes had street corner conversations where our jaws are dropping to the sidewalk as people literally say how great you're writing that book, and like, oh, these students who need extra time on their exams.
It's such a pain to me.
And we're kind of like, okay, what do we say to that?
Same conversation. So
Yeah.
could we turn now, if that's all right, in the time left to us, as the actress said to the bishop, to the co-edited volume that you guys produced with a couple of other folks, which I guess was troping Douglas Crimp's article from the late 80s, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's named in honor of that. Yeah.
How to be disabled in a pandemic, which, even though Disability Worlds was partially written during the pandemic, this volume really focuses on that and on New York City and on activism, action, difficulties experienced, and so on, in what was one of the tragic centers of the horror of this disease and its mismanagement by many governments and public health systems. So could you tell us a wee bit about the edited collection?
Yeah, so our co-editors, Mara Mills, who's a wonderful disability scholar, and with Mara, I started the Center for Disability Studies here. She's a historian of technology, focusing on blind and deaf technology, and she's wonderful. And she also there was a student, Harris Kornstein, who also has like a whole parallel life as a drag activist, and had written about, had been doing some work on MECS, chronic fatigue syndrome issues. Anyway, so initially it was me, Mara, and Rayna getting together saying we should be raising money to give support to people across generations and activists and artists and scholars to look at all the different what's happening with all the different communities of disabled folks in the city.
Middle of COVID, the early COVID years, before there was medicine, before there were vaccines, when it was a real shit show in the hospitals and a lot of bias against disabled people. So first we got a tiny seed grant from NYU, thank you NYU, and then we applied to NSF and were fortunate to get a grant from them.
Which is the National Science Foundation.
Right.
Or last we looked, it still was.
It was the National
It's being renamed by presidential edict, the National Bullshit Foundation.
Yeah, really. We'll see. But in any case, it enabled us to hire a bunch of graduate students, postdocs, community activists, all of whom were already working in certain disability communities, and they reported it. They gave accounts of those worlds. So anything from seniors in Chinatown who were basically Chinese language speakers during the anti-Asianism of early COVID and throughout COVID, people in prisons and the detention centers for immigrants, people with autism for whom the Biden kind of benefit of extra money enabled them to quit low-level jobs and actually reassess their lives. It's not all doom and gloom, although there's plenty of doom and gloom in the book, and a timeline. Thank you, Mara, our co-editor, who is, as a historian, insisted on this, that shows you just all the activism that was going on throughout the early years of the pandemic. But in the process, there's also a lot of creativity, the way in which the communities with chronic fatigue syndrome were in constant dialogue with the new long COVID emergent activism community, or the chapter we wrote, which mirrors stuff in our book about what's going to happen to families who have a disabled So, of the many chapters in the book, the one we did, which in a way is just kind of an earlier version of what ends up in Disability Worlds, we're looking at families who always knew that the disabled adult member was going to need care beyond the point where perhaps they'd be around to give it. But suddenly COVID meant I could be dead in a month. What's going to happen to my disabled son? So it put into high gear, it accelerated a sense of crisis about the future and the future of caregiving in America. So.
Yeah, and we also chronicle a wonderful film project that emerged kind of accidentally, as many things did, called Fire Through Dry Grass, which we recommend. It's online, you can see it. And it was made by all these basically Black and brown residents of a state-funded care facility where people with gunshot wounds and things like that were mixed in, and suddenly they were like having COVID patients slammed into their rooms. And so they recorded everything on their cell phones and the corruption that was going on there. So it's quite astonishing, like how people were, other disabled adults who took whatever technology was available to them to reveal what was going on behind the scenes in these settings. So anyway, we met just in terms of method, it was super interesting because, of course, disability is never singular. And so getting all these amazing people at many different locations and points in their careers and so forth to work on the communities they're already embedded in. And I would say about every 2 weeks, we had a pretty robust
on
Zoom meeting where people would talk about what they were doing, report on stuff. We would occasionally invite guests who were doing kind of parallel projects.
Research. Yeah.
And it was a great way to keep everyone going. I think particularly some of our grad students who were kind of stuck. We're so grateful to be able to participate in this and get
we
some
were grateful
funding.
to NSF, now the National Bullshit, whatever. But they gave us, what is a grant money enabled us to redistribute to all those graduate students and community activists and people who needed to keep going. And we needed them to do the research and be part of this project. So It was really great to be able to meet regularly and sort of keep each other afloat through this process.
You bet. So folks, I have one more question that I'd like to ask of you. It's a slightly boring question, unlike my other incredibly thrilling, sexy ones. But once you've answered that, if you deign to, I wanted to give each of you the opportunity to make some further statement, a remark that might touch on things that we've already mentioned, where you want to elaborate a little more, or perhaps something we haven't discussed that you'd like to introduce. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a close?
Sure.
Yeah, it's like a diving board into an empty pool.
Ooh. I prefer to think there's water. We're diving, but it's water.
The pool in the building where I live, which is a bougie gated community to keep people safe in Guadalajara, is occupied by dengue carrying mosquitoes. So it might be better to dive in when there was no water.
Or at least walk in.
Or be a walk-in, yes. So my boring question is a very scholarly one in a sense, but slightly nasty as well. And it's to ask, because you mentioned earlier, both of you, that you've had some colleagues or some friends who were impressed by the work you're doing, but irritated by the presence of disabled folks. I wanted to ask, what are the disciplines over the years that you've been looking at disability that have impressed you, that you've learned from, that were helpful, versus those that really couldn't give a toss or were unhelpful in their logics, their operation, their research? That may not be a real division. I don't know.
Well, I think one of the exciting things about this is when we, having been advocates and constant partners in other kinds of research and writing, particularly around the politics of reproduction, when we really decided to go forward with this as research, we had to retrain ourselves in disability studies, which is a very exciting field. I have an entire bookshelf about to collapse on my head of all these extraordinary books.
Many of them within the last 10 years, although there's an honorable lineage before that.
So we became, it's a great thing to do, and we're very humbled by the extraordinary work of so many disabled scholars and activists and others, and going to all these, art shows. So we had to, that is like what should everyone should do, is like it sort of later life as a scholar, to really kind of retrain and encounter an entirely other universe that is in itself interdisciplinary. As you know, disability studies emerged in different places out of both humanities and qualitative social science in the UK, and Australia is kind of in between as another center for that work. So I think we were really, and I'll just say one last thing, turn it over to Rayna, which is I'm excited to see like the concept disability worlds, which we finally, like, we have to rebrand.
It's our only title. We call everything this.
Yeah, since 2013, and like we finally were like, okay, now the book's out, we have to think of another title. But we're seeing it's being incorporated. So that idea, which is how we bring an anthropological kind of sensibility to it, which is people create worlds around their embodiment and their cultural sensibilities and their limits, and create spaces. And right now disability worlds are very complicated and often negative and scary, but nonetheless, but we're seeing that idea and the more anthropological approach being incorporated into the disability studies universe, I guess, in a way that is something we were tempted to maybe write a book that was a little more popular. We could have done that. We had our personal memoir stories, we had all these, but we actually were very determined to make a big intervention into our own discipline in anthropology.
I want to pick up from that point, which is to go back to your question, Toby. I would say that history and historians were right out of the box able to really give a very robust and profound lineage to the question of disability, injustice, exclusion, eugenics, you name it, early death, institutionalization, all those things the historians did well. I would say the anthropologists did rather poorly for a very long time. There are some wonderful articles about why that might be the case, written by disabled anthropologists who study disability and talk essentially about the Lone Ranger, to use Renato Rosaldo's image of the field worker, as hero, and why that might have been part of discouraging people with disabilities to do field work, etc. Doesn't matter. What's happening now is what Faye was just pointing to. There is a whole younger generation of people with disabilities who have trained in anthropology and are doing marvelous work. We are part of a group that's presenting at the next anthropology meetings in November that has, I think, 7 new books that have come out within the last year, all ethnographies about disability in different parts of the world, with those authors talking to one another. So there is a place, there's a whole research network within the anthropology, the AAA Association, that helps to make a space where people can connect. And this is, again, pretty recent, but it's been growing, and I feel much more optimistic now about the future of thinking about disability in anthropology than I did, 10, 15 years ago.
But we were like ashamed of a field dedicated to studying
human diversity.
And every form of human difference, which had, in a sense, this idea of this kind of human difference, which is everywhere. So we feel good about having
been part of that,
been making interventions along the way.
And so on to this opportunity, if you wish, to say some more things. Those things, as I said, could be about terrain we've already covered, or perhaps some things that we haven't addressed that you'd like to raise.
Question of hope.
Good question. Yeah. So, well, I think, we're very mobilized, as I think are many people, about pushing back against the current administration's denial of resources and support, the erasure of data, the defunding of education in all the ways. So I think we're very committed to that political project, and any way that our writing, which is some of which is out there now, can help to call attention to that, has been very significant for us. And then, Rayna, I don't know if you want to say, in terms of our research.
Where we're going is a little unformed yet, but we are very interested in what turned up in that COVID research that we talked about a few minutes ago, which is the question of what happens when people with disability have successfully entered the public domain. There are, at least, no matter how contested, some care giving services and support in communities. What happens as they outlive their, what would have been their expected life, their life expectancy half a generation ago? And what happens as their families can no longer take care of them because they themselves are debilitating or dying? So the question of home and what home represents, using a disability perspective for the future, seems very important to us. But once you open up home, you've got a worldwide crisis, whether it's the real estate crisis and homelessness, it's climate change and the end of environments, it's refugee status from war. I mean, the question of home, it seems to us, is a place where disability intersects so many other big questions that's, I think, the place we're going next.
Well, that's going to be very exciting as a further turn. Thank you both very much for writing and editing these two terrific books, which I've had the great privilege of leafing through, thanks to your sharing them with me. And I think How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic is freely available for download, if I got that right.
So you can use the ebook, yeah,
It's
right
open,
on the website.
It's open access.
Open access. So I think that is also a great contribution, but especially for sharing this time this afternoon with me. It's been great, and I thank you for that. And I would hope that at some point in the future, perhaps you'll come back and we can do this again with some of your students or some of your colleagues writing about these things, and just get the band back together again.
Lovely.
Toby, thank you so much for inviting us, and as always, being a very wonderful interlocutor. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So it's such a lively intervention you've managed to pull off. So thank you.